Hello and welcome back to English from the North, the podcast for English learners from an intermediate to advanced level who want to enjoy their English content with a bit more of a Scottish twist. My name is Lewis and welcome back to the podcast. So in this episode we are going to be looking at my journey learning French. In the last episode, we spoke about, or I say we, I spoke about my sort of journey learning Spanish and all that kind of stuff over the last 3 years. And in this one, I'm going to look at my learning French, how that went, things I used, and the things that I still use today. So to give a bit of backstory on why I started learning French, basically it has everything to do with rugby. I'm a big rugby fan. I've been interested in rugby for the last sort of 15 years of my life or so. I started really following it in sort of end of 2009, start of 2010, and in the April of 2021, I think, me and a friend basically were able to buy tickets to go to the Rugby World Cup, which was held in France this past September in 2023. So I knew about this in advance. I knew that I was going to be going, for a few years, I knew that I was going to be going to France to go and see the Rugby World Cup, and I was going to be staying in St Etienne, which is this small city. I say small city, it's actually about the same size as Dundee, funnily enough, in the city that I'm from in Scotland, if you haven't listened to the first episode. So it's a very similar size to my city, just about half an hour away by train from Lyon. So I was going to be going there, and kind of at the time I'd thought, right, okay, well, I need to start learning some French for it, and I therefore decided to start learning French literally the first day of 2023, and the day I was going to go to France was, I believe it was like the 9th of September, thereabouts. So I had a little bit over 8 months to really kind of maximise my learning, and my goal was to get a level of about B1 on the CEFR scale. I still haven't made an episode on that. I'm going to do an episode on that at some point, sort of explaining A2, B1, what does it all really mean. But essentially a level of B1 is like an intermediate level, so you can hold sort of decent conversations and that kind of thing. There's still a bit of kind of adaptation needed from the person that you're speaking to, but it's the level below what you would consider to be fluent. Fluent would be about B2, so it's kind of like the level below you can, I guess, start using the words like fluent and things like that. I knew how I was going to approach this. I knew how I wanted to approach the learning of French, because I'd basically spent all of 2022 with Spanish figuring out what worked. I had discovered comprehensible input, like I spoke about in the last episode, this way of kind of learning language by reading lots of stories and watching lots of videos and listening to lots of podcasts and things like that, starting out at a very basic level and very quickly building on there. And about sort of October, November time in 2022 was when I really started to kind of look and compile useful resources, and I'd essentially assembled a bunch that I knew I was going to start using. And to start off, those were Alice Ayel, a woman called Alice Ayel. She has a YouTube channel, she also has a website, and she's very big on comprehensible input. She's a big believer in comprehensible input. She's used it for, I think, learning Spanish and German and Portuguese and all sorts of language. She wouldn't say that she has learnt the languages, she says that she has acquired the languages, so she's quite a big believer in that. So I had her website, which her course starts all the way from beginner all the way up to I believe she says advanced. I'm not sure what it is on the CEFR scale, but it's I think it's basically like absolute beginner all the way to about sort of B1, B2 at a decent level. Also, I went with another book called Le Français par la méthode nature, which is basically just French by the nature method. And what the nature method is it's basically like comprehensible input. It starts off with a basic story. So this book is a big, thick tome, we would say in English. A tome is like a sort of a big, sort of old book. You imagine kind of like, I don't know, something from like Game of Thrones with a big thick leather cover. That would be a tome. And this book is an example of that. I bought it from a website called, well, the company is called Ayan Academy. I think they're a language academy based in Turkey, but they're big on comprehensible input and the nature method and all that kind of stuff. They actually have the PDF of the nature method book available for free on their Patreon, which is a fantastic resource. In addition to that, they also have videos on their YouTube channel of somebody reading out the pages in a really, really, authentic French accent, which is perfect. Like I say, I mentioned it in the last episode. Reading and listening to things at the same time is a fantastic way to really boost your learning, especially with a language like French and indeed a language like English, where the spelling and the sounds don't always match up. There's quite a discrepancy, quite a big difference. So reading and listening is a fantastic technique to use with any language, but especially these languages like French, like English, and so on. So I've got Alice Yale's website, this Nature Method book. I also had Ollie Richards' Story Learning Uncovered courses. I mentioned that in the last podcast as well, how good that was. And so I wanted to start with that from absolute beginner, which is not something I'd been able to do with Spanish because I discovered Ollie Richards' Story Learning once I already had a bit of an intermediate level. In addition to this, I also had a book from a company called Asimil. I think it's Asimili. I think it's Asimil, but anyway, the Asimil method, and also some other YouTube channels. So one called just French Comprehensible Input on YouTube, which is by a Swiss guy. So quite a variety of comprehensible input things. In addition to this, I also had lessons. I started lessons with a tutor from the very beginning. However, they weren't lessons in the classic sense of I was going to be speaking from the very beginning. In fact, I was deliberately doing the opposite. So what do I mean by that? I meant that, well, for the first 5 weeks of my French learning, so basically all of January and part of February, I didn't speak in these lessons. And you think, well, that sounds a bit strange. How did you have a class then if you didn't speak? What I did was I took inspiration from a video made by, the channel's name is Polyglot a Lot. I don't actually know the name of the gentleman, but basically he's a professor of languages at a university in the US. I think he teaches Spanish. He's an American, I think a native English speaker, but he teaches Spanish and other languages by using comprehensible input. And his video is called, I think it's How I Learned Arabic in 1 Year. So he learned to become fluent in Arabic in 1 year. And he used it using entirely the comprehensible input method. I think, in fact, he even interviewed Dr. Stephen Krashen, who is the man who basically kind of popularized the theory of comprehensible input. And so what he did was he approached people and native Arabic speakers and said, right, I have these books, I have these magazines, I have these images. I would like you to explain them to me very thoroughly with very slow, very easy to understand language so that I can absorb the language. Because basically the thinking behind sort of comprehensible input, what Stephen Krashen and others would say, is that the longer you delay speaking, the better your accent and your understanding of the language was going to be. So I thought, well, I'll try this. Not for what they recommend, which is you spend hundreds and hundreds of hours listening before you get started. I was doing like 5 weeks basically, which was about, I think, 100 hours in total. So the lessons, I kind of approached this tutor on Italki. If you don't know Italki, it's a fantastic website where you can find tutors to teach you basically any language in the world. There are so many tutors, English, French, Spanish, but really anything, even the more sort of obscure languages. It's fantastic. It's where I've discovered most of my tutors. Well, all of them, with except Raul, actually. So I say the vast majority. All of them apart from Raul, who's one of the Spanish tutors I have. So I approached a lady on Italki and I said, oh, I'm interested in learning French. I want to do it this way. Is this okay? Would you be, interested in teaching some lessons like this? And she was happy. She was like, oh yeah, cool. That sounds interesting. Sounds different. I'm totally down for it. I sent her the video of the Polyglot a Lot Arabic video so she could understand what it was all about, but she was quite happy to do that. And so we began. So my daily routine at the very start was I'd have one lesson of 90 minutes once a week where she would kind of talk about these images, describe these images. I would ask questions in English. She would ask me what we'd call concept checking questions in French, so like yes or no questions, just to make sure I really understood what was going on. I was going through Alice Ayel's course on her website. I was using the Nature Method book. I was using the Asimil book, where you had to kind of read a chapter, sort of one chapter a day. Again, like a kind of short story, another way of sort of comprehensible input. And I was also listening and watching YouTube in my spare time. So that went on for a few weeks. After about 5-6 weeks, I started speaking in the classes. They changed to more sort of conversational classes, and my tutor was impressed. She went, we had the first class and she said to me, so have you've spoken French before though? And I was like, well, no, I literally started from zero. And she was quite impressed, and I was able to kind of have, again, very basic conversations, but it was good. I was able to understand a lot of what was being said. Obviously there was still lots of hesitations and how do you say that word, talking in English, but it was a good start. And so I kept building with that one. Then I started to incorporate in a couple of apps in addition to this. Normally I try to stay away from apps after a point, but I think in the beginning apps can be useful just to build sort of a core of vocabulary. it's quite a useful thing just to, I say to, and this isn't scientific, there's no kind of basis, this is my own interpretation. I take it as a way of kind of like priming my brain, I would say. So what I mean by that is like I'll use an app like Speakly and Memrise are the ones I was using, which is just like these sorts of vocabulary flashcard type apps, just to learn the first sort of like 1,000, kind of 2,000 most common words. I don't like go on them for loads of time, maybe just 5 or 10 minutes a day to just encounter some new words. My brain kind of registers them for the first time so that in the future when they come up in a story or some kind of comprehensible input, I can understand them. So I was started to do that as well after about a few weeks. Kept working through the story learning courses and all this kind of stuff, completed the Asimil book, completed the Nature Method book over the kind of next few months of 2023, kept having all these lessons. And it was around about sort of April time. I remember this because I was on holiday in Spain and I thought, well, I'd heard people talking about Inner French, this podcast, I'll give that a go. So I started listening to Inner French. It's sort of at about an intermediate level, and I thought I was maybe going to struggle with it, but I was quite surprised that after about 3-4 months I could listen to this podcast and I could understand quite a lot of it. So I started listening to the Inner French podcast every day because there was quite a backlog, so I just listened to kind of one episode a day that was about half an hour, and so I started incorporating that into my routine. He's also released some courses, the gentleman that's made Inner French, whose name I can't quite remember right now, but he'd made some courses, and so I bought his kind of courses to work through them as well. He's another big advocate for comprehensible input. So I was taking in all of this comprehensible input, having these like weekly classes, and then in July time I changed the tutor, the lady that I'd been with at the start. Unfortunately, due to our schedules and changing things like that, I couldn't keep up with like her hours. Just didn't really work out because she had got a new job and everything like that, so I had to change, and I found another tutor, and is one of my current French tutors, a girl named Fadia, who's from Morocco. She's not actually, well, we were actually talking about it today. I had a French lesson today, the day I'm recording this episode. She wouldn't say, I think she's a native speaker. However, she's also, because, she's lived in Morocco, grown up in Morocco. However, she was telling me today that she's sort of spoken French kind of ever since she was young, and she learned the French alphabet, or the Latin alphabet, before she learned the Arabic alphabet. So she speaks quite a few languages. Very, very impressive, actually. But anyway, she was saying, so she's, I guess, not technically a native speaker, but kind of also. I'm also going to make an episode at some point about looking at, do you need to learn from a native speaker? Do you need to learn languages from a native speaker? The short answer is no, it's not necessary. There are non-native speakers are just as good as native speakers when it comes to teachers. They have some advantages and some disadvantages. There is advantages and disadvantages to having a native speaker as a teacher. There are advantages and disadvantages to having a non-native speaker as a teacher. But I want to have a look at that at some point as well. But anyway, to return to the story, I started taking lessons with her in July, and I decided to kind of ask for an assessment of like progress, like, well, what do you think my level is? And she said to me, oh, you're definitely at the beginnings of B2, which I was like mind blown. I was over the moon, to use another expression. I was very shocked, but very, very happy with that, because like I said at the start, my goal for French was to get to B1 by September, and here I was in July with a level of B2. So I was really, really happy with that. So I kept taking lessons with her, kept completing all these courses, discovered some new podcasts. One is Le Français avec Fluidité, French with Fluidity. Would you say that in English? French with Fluidity? Something like that. I started listening to that every day, working my way through the backlog of that and practicing away. September came. I went to France, had a good time, was able to have conversations after only, studying French for sort of 8-9 months. Still struggled a bit. There's sort of this reputation, French people have this reputation, or at least online, there's this idea or this reputation that French people have, that they hate speaking English, and, they only want to speak French with you and all that kind of stuff. I found the opposite was true. They were very, very happy to speak English with me. I just struggled to speak French sometimes. They were so keen to speak English with me. But I still, still had a good time, was able to connect with all these people and meet all these wonderful people, which is what language learning is all about. So had a good time in France, came back towards the end of September, and just basically kept on with the routine, completed all these courses that I was doing, sort of story learning, comprehensible input and all that kind of stuff, and basically kept on with the same routine. So what does my routine look like now? basically, it's just similar to my Spanish routine. So I'll listen to some podcasts. I will try and read for half an hour every day. I've got lessons once a week. It's 2 lessons on a Sunday. So I have a lesson with Fadia and about sort of lunchtime, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and then I have another lesson on Sunday evening with a man called Christophe, who's French, but he lives in London. He's lived in London for, I think it was like 20 years or something, a very, very long time. But we have lessons with those two. In my lessons, any vocabulary that I'm not sure about, I'll take notes and I'll make Anki flashcards with them to practice as well. So I'll also practice with my deck of Anki flashcards like I do with my Spanish. And again, Anki and all that kind of stuff, I spoke about that in the last episode as well. So another very, very useful resource. But that's essentially what my daily routine looks like. Very similar to my Spanish routine, but with just sort of resources that are a bit lower, because my French is a bit lower than my Spanish. It's about sort of a B2 level. So that's sort of podcasts during the day, try and read a sort of chapter in the evening, and then practice with Anki flashcards and have my lessons on the Sunday. So where do I want to go with French in the future? I think it's just a case of keep working away at it. I've not been to France nearly as many times as I've been to Spain. I haven't been to any other country nearly as many times as I've been to Spain. I've been to Spain 14 times, as I said in the last episode. Well, 13. I'm away to Spain in a few weeks' time, and that'll be number 14. I've literally been to France twice, and the second time was the World Cup. So the plan is to keep practicing away, go back to France, really kind of help to discover the culture a bit more, and maybe also, visit some other French-speaking countries in Africa. That's mostly in Africa, actually. There's where there are other sort of Caribbean islands and then the French overseas territories and things like that. But maybe it's a case of discovering them in the future, and maybe also getting an official examination as well. Like I'm practicing for the Spanish one, which I'll be taking in May. I might take the official French one for either B2 or C1 at the end of this year, but really need to see how the time works out and how my schedule is for all of that. But for now, I'm just going to continue with the same routine, ramp up the difficulty. We would say, increase the difficulty of the resources. Although, to be fair, I do also listen to some French native level content, news, and you watch YouTube channels and things like that. Although they are a bit more challenging than the equivalent is in Spanish, which that basically tells me that my French isn't quite as good, so still keep listening to those podcasts like Le Français avec Fluidité, another one, I'm Polyglot by Lionel Jr., another one, Easy French, and those kinds of things. Those are, again, very, very useful. But it's always getting better, and that's the good thing about comprehensible input. The more hours you put into it, the stronger and the better it gets, essentially. So that's a bit of a long, rambling look at my French kind of journey with learning French and things like that. Again, a very similar story to Spanish, except I was able to kind of go into it with a lot more focus and a lot more precision, and I think that's why I was able to get sort of better results in it, or not better results, but the same results with my Spanish, but more quickly, essentially. And don't, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh man, he got to B2 level in French after only however many months or things like that. That is true. However, the big caveat, the big exception, I would say, is that I was spending like 3 hours a day. Okay, like it was a lot of time, an average of it at 1.3 hours a day. I've spent almost 1,000 hours in the last 12 months learning French. And I think it's important when we talk about language learning, don't look at it in the number of don't look at it in the number of days or months or things like that you've spent. Look at it in the number of hours. Think about the number of hours that you've spent, because that's the main thing. There's nothing wrong if you can only spend 5-10 minutes a day, half an hour a day on a language, that's great. If you can spend more, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, that's fantastic. The only difference is how fast you're going to advance. If you can only spend 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, that's fantastic. Something is better than nothing, and you're going to make it eventually. It's just some people will get there more quickly than others, although I realize that not everybody has the luxury of being able to spend hours and hours a day on language learning. Related to that as well, 1 hour every day is better than 8 hours one day a week. So for example, don't only study once a week. Try and do a little bit every day, and it can just be a little bit, it can be more, but that would be another just general tip for language learning. There is the consistency. Okay, the consistency is really, really important. So choose good resources, be consistent, and you'll be fine. So I think that about wraps it up. thank you all for listening once again. Once more, the transcript is in the description below. Any questions or anything like that, feel free to send me an email, and I'll see you all in the next episode. So thank you very much, and bye bye.